for joining us for another episode of Ask a Historian. I'm Matthew Wilkinson, historian with Heritage Mississauga. Please remember to send in your questions and join us each week as we explore the stories of the city of Mississauga and beyond. Like, subscribe, and follow us and stay up to date on all the heritage happenings with Heritage Mississauga. Joining us this week for Ask a Historian is Professor Anna Thomas, an assistant professor in the Department of English and Drama at UTM, University of Toronto at Mississauga. She has a special focus on African-American literature and diaspora studies. And so, Professor Thomas, thank you so much for joining us and exploring early African-American literature and its connection to life and times and evolution of ideas around the abolitionist period. And again, thank you for joining us and exploring this with us.
You're very welcome. It's a pleasure to be here. I think it's really interesting how you framed the idea of questions of the past influencing our current moment. I found, so I work in the 19th and 20th centuries across the Caribbean and the United States primarily. And so many of the questions that I was interested in thinking about started pulling me further back in history. And that process of discovering that all of the questions that I thought were exciting and burning had in fact been asked before and explored before is a constantly humbling and intellectually exciting experience. So I'm really glad to be here, and I hope that some of that range will come through in our conversation.
Well, it is. I remember that there's a, probably a famous quote along the lines, if history teaches anything, is that we don't learn from history. These questions, I think we often focus our own narratives when we're exploring early Black history and its connections here in Mississauga, in Ontario and Canada and beyond. Quite often our stories start with this the Underground Railway and changing attitudes towards slavery and this idea that we have this connection of people who came to this place who themselves were in some way connected to or affected by the institution of slavery. But I remember a conversation I had recently where the quote was used that our story doesn't begin with slavery. Slavery interrupted our story, so we have this. I guess this interruption of a narrative becomes a focal point in terms of understanding people and place and time. And so, in your expertise and your focus area is on those early literature resources around that changing evolution. Is there a time period that you would focus on in terms of the resources that you would consult? Are you looking at things that are kind of like 1800 to 1870, or what is your focus in terms of the time period?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the second half of the 19th century mostly, and then into about the first half of the 20th is where my interest really lies. And part of that, so I'm a literary studies person, and I work on slave narratives, particularly Harriet Jacobs' Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, which is the earliest text that I write on. What is really exciting to me and often to my students, I teach incidents basically in every class that I teach because it's an extraordinarily wise text, I think. But one of the things that Jacobs does that connects to that idea of an interrupted story is she really establishes a matrilineal lineage. Her grandmother is extraordinarily important to her in that text, and in many of the gestures that she makes to position herself as a sort of ethical subject. So one of my interests is the intersection of literature and ethics. So part of what she does in establishing herself as an ethical subject is to reference not the majoritarian, dominant, white, Southern code of morality, but rather to think through the precepts of her grandmother. Sometimes those precepts might align with dominant views, but she's very careful to align her own ethical orientation to the world to this matrilineal line. And that's extraordinarily important for many reasons. I think it's interesting from the perspective of the study of ethics. So there's a category of ethical philosophy, Vina Das is someone who works on this, called ordinary ethics. And so it's thinking about, okay, how do people in a non-disciplinary way understand and articulate what it means to live a good life or to have an ethical orientation to the world. So I think that orientation to a matrilineal line is really important and interesting from that perspective. But it's also extraordinarily important because of the very mechanisms of violence and dispossession that sought to destroy the fabric of kinship structures by slavery. So in the United States,
by that you mean the forced separation of family units and
exactly. And this is sort of the idea that one follows the condition of the mother, so that one inherits one's freedom status from your mother as a way of ensuring the continued growth of the slave population and therefore a labor population. But also with the view that was sort of hotly debated at the time, but was debated at the time, about whether or not people of African descent had the capacity to form deep family ties to begin with. So this was often used as a justification for the separation of families. Well, in fact, people of African descent don't have the same family making sort of capacities as white people do. So what Harriet Jacobs does, which I think is sort of endlessly interesting and important, is to really demonstrate the importance, on the one hand, of the autonomy and capacity to live an ethical life. And on the other hand, the importance and not merely capacity for family relations, because it's more than that, in part because of this other piece, but the extraordinary depth of family ties when they are in fact allowed to exist. So that's a bit about what I think about and what my approach to some of these early narratives are. And then because I sort of work forward in time, there's a genre of literature called the neo-slave narrative, for example. And so these questions get repeated again and again and are staged in different ways. Maybe many people may have read Beloved. You can think about the ways that some of those questions might get restaged in Morrison's revisitation about the relationship between motherhood and slavery. And for me, it's exciting to see how Jacobs isn't just evidencing these questions, she's really interrogating and theorizing about these questions in complex ways.
Well, I right off the bat here, I've got a new book that I'm interested in exploring myself. So she's writing, I believe, in 1861 originally. So of course we're on the eve of the Civil War, or in the beginning of the Civil War. Have you explored at all kind of the impacts that her writing would have had on the people who might have read that book at the time? Because I've come across other books that may or may not have been quite as popular at the time they were written, but came to more kind of mainstream understanding and acceptance later. Thinking again to something like 12 Years a Slave, which I think was much more kind of accepted narrative, kind of in the 1880s and 1890s, 30 years after it was written. I'm just curious if you draw comparisons to the life and times of the publication and the author themselves.
That's a really fabulous question, because actually her text was, so she writes under a pseudonym. So Linda Brent is her pseudonym in the narrative, and it was mischaracterized as a novel for a very long time until the 70s. So then it was re-entered into the Academy as a slave narrative, which is extraordinarily important, in part because it's the longest narrative that we have of a woman, written by a woman. Wow. And that has a lot of some of the choices that she's making, and part of the reason that it was sort of misreceived. She is accessing tropes around, or tropes of domestic fiction, seduction fiction, sort of women's genres of the time, in order to articulate particularly sexual violence. So the sort of archetypal slave narrative, which is sort of masculine voice, really follows, a particular set of conventions, including, importantly, a moment of a clear break from slavery. And Jacobs hides for 7 years in a garret near her site of enslavement, in this sort of state of the scholar Catherine McKittrick talks about her being above slavery. So she's changed her spatial relationship to slavery without having escaped it. And this is in part, this in part maintains her relationship to her children. She can hear them. So there's this really fascinating relationship of sensorial connection. She can hear their voices. She can hear them at play. So in using some tropes of sort of women's fiction, she is able to articulate concepts of consent and sexual violence, which was sort of extraordinarily shocking to talk about openly, and that those literary mechanisms allow her to do that, which is really fascinating to read.
You said that she wrote initially under a pseudonym. Was this to protect her identity and that of her children, or was this a way to get published, or do we know why she wrote?
I'm sure we do know. I don't have the answer at the tip of my. My assumption is to protect identity, but I haven't looked into the whys and wherefores of that particular choice, actually. Like many slave narratives, there are authenticating documents that accompany the text to sort of attest to her character and the truth of her narrative, written by Lydia Maria Child. So obviously being so forthright, particularly about the topic of having children outside of marriage, was something that she expresses in the text, sort of difficulty and even reluctance to speak about. So it's a really important document about concepts of consent, choice, reproduction, that is just a really sort of precious document.
So in she's writing in 1861, and she's at a time when there is I don't know if an uptick is the right word to use, but there's an increase in kind of abolitionist leaning publications, narratives, books that are being produced, some of them quite famous today. And just, is this part in parallel with that? Does it help inspire the abolitionist movement, or is it in turn inspired by the abolitionist movement? Like how does literature tie into the abolitionist movement that we see leading into the American Civil War period?
Yeah, I mean, they're extraordinarily intertwined. The idea of giving an account of the evils of slavery did two things. One, it's sort of the consciousness of rousing fact of hearing about atrocities. And second, the demonstration of sort of the capacities for complex thought, which is sort of always complicated to, or is you know, a sight of sorrow that, okay, well, look, I can prove that that slavery shouldn't exist because see, I am this articulate person who's able to describe injustices, to point out hypocrisies, to perhaps interpret scripture in order to critique the institution of slavery. So there is this element that that the capacity to articulate one's narrative is evidence of the injustice of enslavement because it's evidence of humanity. There's a connection too, though, between abolitionist circuits where formerly enslaved people would display their wounds, for example, their scars from whippings. And so that actually also is a tie-in with literary accounts. There's often a focus on, or a moment about the idea of the scar. And there's this wonderful passage in Frederick Douglass's narrative where he talks about being so cold that his feet crack, and the width of the crack on his foot fits a pen. God. So you see that there's this in addition to giving an account of one's lived experience, there is this thinking through and metaphorizing about the relationship between suffering and writing. So the scar being the, or the crack being the size of a pen, the pen being the measure of the wound.
You know, one of the challenges you know, in terms of getting my own head around the subject, and I do wonder about our listeners as well, but, you know, the authors that are writing in this abolitionist time frame, and not only with slave narratives, but the material that comes out after the Civil War, you know, were the authors predominantly white or black, and kind of what was the approach? You know, a white moral approach versus you know, a black experiential approach of those that were once enslaved. I just, you know, in your own research, how do you kind of navigate that world and explore the two concepts, perhaps?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So there emerges sort of at this time, and then in the critical literature that speaks about it, a really persistent question around the politics of representation. So one example would be Uncle Tom's Cabin being this important text within abolitionism that has generally become a site of critique, and a lot of authors subsequently sort of speak back to the representations of Blackness of Uncle Tom's Cabin. Being an Uncle Tom is a colloquialism that emerges from that text. And so there is this real power dynamic between white authors who are able to write and explore questions of enslavement comparatively more freely, and the burdens of not only representation and giving an account of oneself and one's life, but also the burdens of having to be authenticated that Black authors at this time were subject to. So, and interestingly, speaking of Harriet Jacobs, she was really adamant that she wanted her narrative to be a standalone piece and not part of a planned supplement to Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe. So there's this real question around the modes of representation, how fiction might come into play from the perspective of white authors, and how practices of authentication are both, producing these narratives that we can learn so much from now, but also putting pressure and demands on them that sort of places the narratives of Black life in like a position of deficit. So out of that comes this question of not only practices of writing, but also questions around reading and responses to reading. There's a really wonderful scholar named Saida Hartman who writes about the question of empathy in her book, Scenes of Subjection. And she gives us an account of an abolitionist who is reading this white male abolitionist who's reading this account of slavery, and he's having this extraordinarily empathetic response. And he is imagining that he himself is in the position of the enslaved person, is, is terrified, is grieved, and then eventually when he's able to return out of the narrative, experiences this relief. And so she's interested in the question about how empathy might in fact return the author to the sort of core and center of their own feelings, and that is an issue that that we have when we're thinking about the intersection of abolitionist texts and not only slave narratives, but the sort of question of Black life, like what are the ways that it is being sort of channeled through not only authentication, but through empathy. And that I find really sort of challenging, because one of the things that I love about literature is that you get to experience interiorities that are not your own. And that's extremely powerful. But Hartman's arguments really raise the question for us about how those questions of empathy might recenter particular identities and experiences.
And I guess, we have a current modern discourse, which I'm sure you intersect with in your studies as well, but around this concept of identity and self-determination, self-awareness, and value in person. But you have, historically, we have an abolitionist movement that a lot of the writings are written by white authors reflecting on these moral dilemmas of slavery, versus these experiential things that maybe don't get the same level of awareness or ability to publish, or be a broad scope in terms of its readership, given the times. I mean, this is my perspective of what I see, where a lot of the things coming out that we reference as pro-abolitionists are not slave narratives. They come about as kind of a white interpretation of what is happening in the slavery period. And so they both have value, I guess, but they also provide that a juxtaposition of study between the narratives and something like Uncle Tom's Cabin, for example. I can imagine you balance the two in terms of your own research and knowledge.
Yeah, I mean, and it's also interesting to teach. Those questions come up a lot in teaching, and obviously being in classrooms with diverse groups of students who are coming to the study of Black literature from sometimes positions where this is the first time that I've thought about these questions. And for others, this is the first time that I've gotten to have the space to think about these questions.
You have obviously studied and read incredible amounts of material, and I imagine that continues. That's probably not an end statement by any stretch.
No, not at all.
We've touched on obviously Harriet Jacobs, and I'm presuming you would recommend that highly as a book to read.
Always.
Wondering if you can give us 2 or 3 others that perhaps that you would consider to our audience. There's something very worthwhile to explore and learn from, and just if you can give us a couple of ideas of reading material.
Yeah, so the first thing that comes to mind is an earlier text. It's from 1832, and it's the narrative of Mary Prince, 1831, pardon. And she's coming from a Caribbean context. One of the things that I work on is questions of comparative diaspora. So I'm thinking about systems of enforced labor, both slavery and later indenture. But I'm thinking about the Black diaspora outside the bounds of national boundaries. So I absolutely would recommend The History of Mary Prince. It's quite short, but gives an important perspective about abolitionism and the experience of enslavement within the British Empire. And then there are other narratives that I myself don't work on. I focus on women's narratives, but absolutely reading Frederick Douglass is extraordinarily important, really foundational. One of the moments in that in Frederick Douglass's narrative describes sort of, you have seen how a man was made a slave. Now you will see how a slave was made a man in this moment of striking his master. So that is a really, if you're interested in sort of putting slave narratives within a broader cultural and literary history of African American literature, that's an extraordinarily important moment. Henry Box Brown. There are many to think with. The ones that I have thought with most, well, the one that I thought with most is certainly Jacobs, but there, yeah, is a lot to cover, and to think about some scholarship, if that is fairly accessible. I would certainly recommend both the work of Catherine McKittrick, who's a human geographer, and she's thinking really across Canadian and African American contexts, as well as Seda Hartman, who's thinking about ideas of what it means to represent violence, which is always a tricky question when we're thinking about literature that arises from contexts of oppression. Like, how do we represent this information without re-inflicting forms of violence? So that would be my short syllabus.
and we'll share a suggested reading list afterwards as well. But thank you so much for exploring that, and thank you for joining us here on Ask the Historian, Professor Thomas. And just you're obviously a wealth of knowledge, and your willingness to share it with our audience and explore this tangled narrative, I guess, of navigating through the abolitionist period in terms of exploring the writing and the influence that it would have had on people, and even that thought, you like you said, these questions have been asked before, and here we are asking them again, and 150 years later, and what you can learn and explore and share from literature of the past is just a fascinating study. And so thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to us here on Ask a Historian. Again, sending your questions each and every week, and stay up to date with the stories of Mississauga and the heritage happenings at Heritage Mississauga. Like, subscribe, and follow us, and we will see you next week.